I wasn't searching for giants when I first encountered the Ural Mountains on a map older than the country I live in. The range sits there, a vertical spine dividing Europe from Asia, marked on early 18th century maps with something unusual: illustrations. Not topographical features, not altitude markings, but drawings of large humanoid figures standing among the peaks. Cartographers didn't do that without reason. They didn't fill blank spaces with fantasy without attribution. Yet when I looked for the source material, the original expedition reports, the field journals, the academic correspondence that justified those illustrations, I found gaps. Pages missing from university archives. Expeditions mentioned only in passing in later texts. A 19th century Russian ethnographer named Novitsky documented something in the northern Urals before his work was suppressed, and he was killed by indigenous tribesmen who, according to official records, simply didn't like outsiders. But the tribesmen told a different story before Novitsky died. They told him about the place where the old people sleep, the place outsiders weren't supposed to find. The official explanation for the giant illustrations on old maps is simple enough: allegory, artistic flourish, the cartographer's whim in an age before satellite imagery. Except the same maps that show giants in the Urals also correctly place cities, rivers, and trade routes with remarkable accuracy for their time. These were not fantasy documents. These were working navigation tools used by merchants and explorers who needed to survive the crossing. So why giants? Why there? And why, when Russian imperial expansion pushed eastward in the 18th and 19th centuries, did multiple surveying expeditions return with stories they were forbidden to publish, with measurements they were ordered to forget, with bones that were somehow lost before they reached St. Petersburg? The Ural Mountains run for more than 1,500 miles from the Arctic tundra down to the steppes of Kazakhstan. They are old mountains, worn down by millions of years of wind and ice, their peaks rounded, their slopes forested with pine and birch that stretch in every direction without end. Crossing them on foot takes weeks. Crossing them in winter kills most who try. The indigenous Komi and Mansi peoples have lived along these slopes for as long as anyone has recorded, and they tell stories that predate the Russian arrival by centuries, stories about the first people, the people who were here before the forests grew, the people whose bones remain in the earth, if you know where to dig. When Russian explorers first pushed beyond the Volga in the 16th century, they encountered something they did not expect. The Mansi spoke of a time when the Urals were inhabited by a race of powerful beings who could throw boulders like children throw stones, who could cross rivers in a single step, who lived in fortress cities built from stone so massive that modern men could not move the blocks. The Russians called these stories pagan superstition and moved on, but they kept finding things. Burials that did not match any known indigenous tradition. Stone tools too large for any human hand to wield comfortably. Skulls recovered from riverbanks during spring floods that local priests were instructed to rebury immediately and never speak of again. The pattern repeats across centuries. An expedition in 1720 under Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt, a German naturalist in Russian service, traveled through western Siberia documenting flora, fauna, and local customs. His journals, preserved in the Russian Academy of Sciences, contain curious gaps, pages removed, sections crossed out with heavy ink. What remains includes references to unusual skeletal remains found near the upper reaches of the Tobol River, remains that local Tatars identified as belonging to the Alpler, the giants who lived before the flood. Messerschmitt measured something, he recorded something. But those measurements no longer exist in the archival record. They were there, then they were not. By the mid-18th century, the Russian Academy had begun organizing systematic exploration of the Urals and Siberia. Gerhard Friedrich Müller traveled extensively through the region between 1733 and 1743. His published work runs to multiple volumes and remains a standard reference for Siberian ethnography. But his unpublished field notes, held in St. Petersburg, contain passages that never made it into print, descriptions of massive bone deposits eroding from riverbanks along the Ob and Irtysh rivers. Mentions of local stories about a time before the Khanty and Mansi arrived, when another people controlled the mountains, people whose dead were buried in stone-lined tombs too large for any ordinary purpose. Müller was a careful scholar. He did not include hearsay in his official reports. So when he wrote these things in his private journals, he believed them worth recording. The question is why he believed them, and why his official publications remained silent on the matter entirely. The 19th century brought more expeditions, more discoveries, and more disappearances from the record. In 1845, a Finnish geologist named Nils Nordenskiöld explored the northern Urals and reported finding a cave filled with human bones near the headwaters of the Pechera River. The cave, known locally as the Divya Pekera, the Wonder Cave, had been used for burials in some distant age, but the bones were not all human. Nordenskiöld noted in his field notes that some of the skeletal remains appeared to belong to individuals significantly larger than any modern population. He did not publish this observation. He mentioned it only in a letter to a colleague in Helsinki. That letter survives, the bones do not. One has to wonder what the threshold of evidence would need to be before the official narrative would acknowledge what these repeated discoveries suggest. How many expeditions must return with consistent accounts before those accounts are taken seriously? How many indigenous nations must tell the same story before that story is treated as historical memory rather than folklore? How many bones must be found and then lost before the pattern itself becomes the evidence? The threshold of evidence is an interesting thing to consider when standing in the shadow of stones that weigh more than a house. The Ural Mountains contain structures that defy easy explanation, not just burials and bones, but arrangements of stone that suggest something other than random natural processes. Archaeologists call them sides, sacred stones, ritual sites of the indigenous Sami and Mansi peoples, but the indigenous peoples themselves say they did not build them. They say the stones were already there when their ancestors arrived. They say the old people put them there, the ones who came before. On Mount Vadovara in the northern Urals, the stones sit in formations that have bothered researchers for decades, boulders weighing tens of tons, balanced on smaller rocks, as if placed deliberately. Flat stones arranged in concentric circles, rectangular blocks positioned with their corners aligned to cardinal directions. Mainstream archaeology attributes these formations to natural processes: frost heave, glacial action, the slow movement of ice pushing rocks into accidental arrangements. But anyone who has stood on Vadovara and looked at these placements feels the inadequacy of that explanation. The balance is too precise, the alignments too consistent, and the local stories too persistent. The Mansi call Vadovara the Death Mountain, a place of evil spirits and forbidden passage. They do not go there. Their shamans say the mountain is a place of power, but not power meant for living men. When Russian researchers began exploring the site systematically in the 1990s, they found something unexpected beneath the moss and lichen covering the stones: carvings. Geometric patterns, solar symbols, and what appeared to be representations of human figures rendered in a style that matches nothing else in the known artistic tradition of the region. The carvings are old. How old? No one can say with certainty. Carbon dating requires organic material, and stone does not cooperate with that method. But the lichen growing over the carvings is centuries old itself, meaning the carvings predate Russian contact by a significant margin. Here is where the Tartaria connection begins to emerge from the shadows of these mountains. The name itself, Tartaria, appeared on maps for centuries, describing a vast region stretching from the Urals to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the borders of China and India. It was not a unified empire in the conventional sense, not a single political entity with a capital and an emperor, but rather a designation, a placeholder for lands that European cartographers knew existed, but could not easily classify. The people who lived there, the Tartars, were described in travel accounts as possessing knowledge and technologies that seemed out of place in the nomadic stereotype assigned to them by Western writers. They worked metal with exceptional skill. They constructed buildings of stone in regions where wood was the only expected material. They maintained roads across distances that shocked visiting merchants accustomed to European mud. And they told stories about giants. The Tartar epic tradition, recorded piecemeal by Russian and German ethnographers in the 18th and 19th centuries, contains repeated references to a race of powerful beings who inhabited the land before human memory. These beings were not gods exactly, though they possessed godlike abilities. They were not demons, though later Islamic and Christian influences sometimes painted them that way. They were simply the first people, the original inhabitants, the ones who taught the ancestors of the Tartars how to work metal and read the stars and build with stone that would last forever. The epics describe their cities as places of wonder, with walls so high they seemed to touch the clouds and gates so massive that 20 men could not move them. And then, in language that varies from teller to teller but carries the same essential meaning, the epics describe something else: the leaving, the going away. The disappearance into the mountains or underground, or across the northern sea, depending on which version you hear. What happened to them? The epics do not say directly, but they contain hints, references to a great cold that came and stayed, references to the sun behaving strangely, rising in the wrong place, or failing to rise at all for longer than it should, references to floods and fires, and times when the world seemed to turn inside out. Geological records from the Ural region confirm that something happened approximately 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The climate shifted dramatically, the glaciers retreated, the permafrost melted, and across the northern hemisphere, megafauna species that had thrived for millennia suddenly vanished. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, all gone within a geological instant. Human populations adapted or migrated or died. But what if some of them did not die? What if they went somewhere else? Somewhere the changing climate made inaccessible, somewhere the advancing forests and rising seas concealed from later generations. The bones keep appearing. Not frequently, not in quantities that force academic reconsideration, but often enough that locals know where to find them, and researchers know where not to look. In 1933, Soviet geologists working near the Kara River in the polar Urals uncovered a burial site unlike any they had seen before. The graves were lined with stone slabs, each slab weighing more than a ton. The skeletons inside were fragmentary, degraded by millennia of freeze-thaw cycles and acidic soil, but the long bones that remained were noticeably longer than expected. The geologists reported their find to the Regional Scientific Committee in Salikard and received immediate instructions to backfill the excavation and report to no one about what they had seen. One of the geologists kept a journal. That journal survived the war and the purges and eventually made its way to Moscow, where it sits today in a private collection inaccessible to most researchers. The entry for the 17th of August 1933 reads simply, "Found something important today, told to forget it, will not forget." If you have ever walked through the Ural foothills and noticed how the ground rises in places where it should not, how the moss covers shapes that seem too regular to be natural, you understand why these stories persist. The earth there does not lie flat. It mounds and swells over hidden things. The rivers cut through banks that contain bones, washed down from somewhere upstream. The forests grow thick over ruins that have not seen sunlight in thousands of years. And the people who live there still tell their children to stay away from certain places, certain caves, certain stone arrangements, certain hills where the ground feels hollow when you walk across it. They do not always know why they tell them this. They only know that the old people said it, and the old people before them said it, and somewhere beneath the moss and the lichen and the slowly turning soil, something waits to be found again. The caves of the Urals hold secrets that do not surrender easily. Entering them requires crawling through passages where the ceiling presses down and the walls close in, where the only light comes from whatever you carry, where the temperature drops and drops until your breath hangs visible in the beam of your headlamp. The indigenous peoples avoided these places. They told stories about spirits that dwelled in the darkness, about voices that called from deep within the mountain, about travelers who entered and never emerged. Modern speleologists attribute these stories to natural phenomena, echoing chambers, rushing water, the mind's tendency to find patterns in random sound. But some of them have emerged from certain caves in the Urals, with expressions that suggest they are not entirely convinced by their own explanations. In 1959, a Soviet geological survey team working near the Kozva River in the central Urals discovered something unexpected in a cave system known locally as the Druza, the Friendship Cave. The entrance had been sealed by a rockfall sometime in the distant past, but spring floods had partially cleared the blockage, revealing a passage that extended deeper than anyone had previously recorded. The team leader, a geologist named Viktor Morozov, entered with 2 assistants and found themselves in a chamber that showed clear signs of human modification. The walls had been smoothed in sections, the floor had been leveled, and in the center of the chamber, arranged in a circle, sat stone seats too large for any ordinary person to use comfortably. Morozov measured the seats. Each stood approximately 4 feet high, with a seat width of nearly 3 feet. The backs rose another 2 feet above that. Anyone sitting in these chairs would need to be significantly taller than the average human, with broader shoulders and longer legs. The indigenous Komi, when shown photographs of the discovery decades later, simply nodded and said, "Those are the old seats," without further explanation. When pressed, they said the old people used them for councils, for meetings where matters of importance were discussed. They did not know who the old people were. They only knew they had been there first. The chamber contained other things as well. Stone tools scattered across the floor, too large for practical use by any modern population. Fragments of what appeared to be ceramic vessels, though the clay was unlike any local source Morozov could identify. And on the walls, carved into the smooth stone, figures. Human figures, but not quite human. Taller, straighter, with elongated skulls and hands that seemed too large for their bodies. The figures stood in rows, facing what appeared to be a central figure seated in the largest of the stone chairs. A gathering, a council. The old seats filled with old people, rendered in stone by someone who had seen them with their own eyes. Morozov reported his find to the Soviet Academy of Sciences and received a response that by now follows a familiar pattern. "Thank you for your report. Your findings have been noted. Please provide exact coordinates and photographs for further study." He provided them. He never heard back. When he attempted to revisit the site the following summer, he found the entrance resealed by what appeared to be a fresh rockfall, though no seismic activity had been recorded in the region during the intervening months. He tried to clear the rubble but gave up after several days. The stones were too large, too many, too deliberately placed to be natural. Someone had closed the cave again. Someone did not want the old seats disturbed. The question worth considering is who that someone might be. The Soviet government had no obvious reason to suppress evidence of ancient cave dwellings. If anything, such discoveries would have served their narrative of continuous human progress toward the communist ideal. But the suppression happened anyway, consistently, repeatedly, across decades, and across administrative boundaries. The pattern suggests either a coordinated policy of concealment or something stranger, something operating outside official channels, something with its own reasons for keeping the old seats hidden. The caves contain other things as well, things that have nothing to do with stone chairs or carved figures. In the 1980s, a team of Ukrainian speleologists exploring the Sumgan cave in the southern Urals reported hearing sounds from deep within the system that they could not explain. Low-frequency vibrations that seemed to pulse in regular intervals. Rhythmic sounds that resembled something between breathing and drumming. They followed the sounds for 2 days, through passages that grew progressively larger, until they emerged into a chamber so vast their lights could not reach the far wall. The sounds were louder here. The floor was smooth, and in the center of the chamber, according to the journal kept by the team leader, something moved in the darkness. They did not stay to investigate. They turned back and emerged 3 days later, having agreed among themselves to tell no one what they had heard or seen. The journal surfaced only after the team leader's death in 2005. The cave remains unvisited by subsequent expeditions. The local guides refused to take anyone near the entrance. What emerged from those caves in the years that followed was not bones or artifacts, but stories. Stories that spread through the small towns and mining camps scattered across the Ural slope, passed between workers in the canteens, shared in whispers by guides who no longer took visitors to certain locations. The stories all carried the same essential detail. Something was down there, something that did not want to be found, something that had been waiting a very long time. In 1997, a team from the Ural State University Department of History received permission to excavate a site near the village of Zaostrovka, where local farmers had been turning up unusually large bones during spring plowing, for as one of this tend, long as anyone could remember. The excavation proceeded normally for the first 2 weeks. They found pottery fragments, stone tools, the remains of hearths, all consistent with known Iron Age settlements in the region. Then they reached a deeper layer, below the Iron Age deposits, separated by a distinct sterile layer of clay and ash. They found something else, a burial. Not a grave cut into the earth from above, but a stone-lined chamber constructed before the clay and ash were deposited. The chamber contained remains. Human remains, but again, not quite human. The skull was elongated, the brow ridge heavy, the jaw powerful. The long bones suggested a height well over 7 feet. The teeth showed wear patterns consistent with a diet heavy in coarse vegetation and raw meat. The team documented everything: photographs, measurements, soil samples, pollen samples for dating. They sent their preliminary report to Moscow and waited. The response came not from the academic authorities they expected, but from a regional administrative office, with no obvious connection to archaeology or history. The site was declared a protected cultural heritage area. Excavation was halted immediately. All materials were to be transferred to a repository in Yekaterinburg for further study. The team complied. They never saw their findings again. The photographs, the measurements, the samples, all disappeared into a system that officially had no record of them ever existing. One of the graduate students involved kept a field notebook. She hid it before the materials were collected, and only spoke of it decades later, when she was old and living in Germany, far from Ural reach. The notebook contains sketches of the burial chamber, diagrams of the skeleton's position, and a single page of reflections written at the end of the dig. "We are not the first people here," she wrote. "And whatever came before us was not primitive. They built with stone. They buried their dead with care. They were large and strong, and they existed for a very long time before something ended them. The clay layer above the chamber is not natural. It is too uniform, too thick, too widespread. Something covered this place deliberately. Something buried them on purpose, and now something is burying them again." The clay layer she described appears at multiple sites across the Urals. Geologists call it a marker horizon, a distinct stratum that can be traced across vast distances and indicates a single event affecting the entire region. What event? The official answer is volcanic ash from eruptions in the Kamchatka Peninsula, thousands of miles away, carried by wind and deposited across the mountains. But volcanic ash does not form a uniform layer 6 feet thick. Volcanic ash does not seal burial chambers without disturbing the contents inside. Volcanic ash does not arrive in quantities sufficient to cover an entire mountain range and then stop as abruptly as it began. There is another explanation, though it requires accepting possibilities that conventional history does not permit. The clay could be something else, something that fell from the sky, something that came not from volcanoes but from above, something that buried the old people in their world so completely that only the deepest chambers survived. Only the caves remained open. Only the stories persisted through the long ages of forgetting that followed. The indigenous accounts speak of a time when the sky fell, when the ground shook, when the world burned and then went dark and cold for longer than anyone could remember. They do not call it a volcanic eruption. They do not call it climate change. They call it the ending, and they say the old people were here before the ending and did not survive it. Except some did. Some went underground, some went into the caves. Some are still there, waiting for the sky to fall again. The evidence accumulates, like sediment, layer upon layer, each discovery buried by the next official denial, each witness silenced by the next convenient accident. After following this thread through archives and excavation reports, through indigenous stories and suppressed field notes, through caves that seal themselves and bones that disappear before they reach laboratory tables, one question finally demands an answer. Not whether giants existed in the Urals. The patterns too consistent, the witnesses too numerous, the physical traces too persistent for simple dismissal. The question is, why the resistance to that conclusion has been so systematic, so thorough, so effective for so long? The answer may lie not in the giants themselves, but in what their existence would force us to reconsider. If a race of large, intelligent beings inhabited the Urals before recorded history, if they built with stone and worked metal and buried their dead with ritual care, then the entire narrative of human development requires revision. We are not the first. We are not the inevitable outcome of steady progress from primitive beginnings. We are simply the latest in a succession of peoples who have risen and fallen across this landscape, and if they could fall, so can we. The indigenous stories contain warnings alongside their histories. The old people were powerful, but not invincible. They mastered their world but could not save themselves when the world changed. They went underground, into the caves, into the mountains, into places where the new people would not find them. And there they remain, according to some versions of the story, waiting for the conditions that allowed their existence to return, waiting for the cold to come again, waiting for the skies to clear of whatever buried them, waiting for the moment when they can emerge and reclaim what was theirs. In 2008, a team of Russian geologists conducting seismic surveys in the northern Urals detected something unexpected beneath the ridge of Mount Narodnaya, the highest peak in the range. Their instruments showed a void, a large empty space approximately 2 kilometers below the surface, too regular in shape to be a natural cavern. The void extended horizontally for nearly a kilometer and rose to a height that their equipment could not precisely determine, but estimated at over 100 meters. They reported the anomaly to their superiors and received the now familiar instruction: classify the data, include it in no published reports, forget what you saw. One of the geologists spoke privately to a journalist before his death in 2015. He said the void showed up on every pass they made, every instrument configuration, every calculation. It was real, it was huge, and it was empty. When asked what he thought might be down there, he paused for a long time before answering. The Mansi say the old people went underground. They say the mountains are hollow. They say the old people are still there, still alive, still waiting. I used to think that was superstition. Now I am not so sure. The journalist who recorded that conversation published it in a small regional newspaper and received death threats within a week. He left Russia shortly afterward and now lives in Canada. He will not say where. He will not say why he left. He will only say that some stories are dangerous because they are true, and the truth about the Urals is dangerous enough that people have died to keep it buried. Perhaps that is the real mystery worth considering. Not whether giants existed, not what happened to them, but why the effort to conceal them has been so sustained, so coordinated, so effective across centuries and regimes and national boundaries. What are we being protected from? What are they afraid we might find if we kept digging? The mountains keep their secrets for now. The caves remain sealed. The bones stay buried. But the earth erodes. The rivers cut deeper each spring. The permafrost thaws and releases what it has held for thousands of years. Eventually, inevitably, the truth will emerge from the Urals, whether anyone wants it to or not. The only question is whether we will be ready when it does. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.